A single death is a tragedy. 1,000,000 deaths is a statistic. Tonight, we explore the life of history's most powerful dictator, a man whose very name became a warning whispered across half the world, Joseph Stalin. To some, he was the leader who saved civilization from fascism, who turned a backwards empire into a superpower. To others, he was the century's greatest monster, architect of famines that killed millions and purges that destroyed a generation. He rose from nothing, a cobbler's son with a withered arm and a pockmarked face. By the time he died, he controlled the fate of 800 million people. His path from the seminary to the Kremlin traces through revolution and civil war and the systematic, ruthless destruction of every rival and friend. Lenin warned the party to remove him. Trotsky called him a mediocrity. They all underestimated the man who collected power the way others collected stamps, carefully, methodically, until he held every piece that mattered. The boy, nicknamed So-So, who sang in the church choir, would become the dictator who dynamited those same churches. The revolutionary who fought the Tsar's oppression would create a police state that made the old empire look gentle. He defeated Hitler, carved up Europe, and died believing everyone around him was plotting his destruction. Perhaps he was right. His own daughter said his final gesture was lifting his hand, as if cursing them all. Before we begin this journey through one of history's darkest lives, I want to know what you think. Was Stalin a necessary evil who modernized Russia and saved it from destruction? Or was he a paranoid murderer who set his country back generations? Let me know in the comments. And if you're finding value in these explorations of history's most complex figures, please consider subscribing. It helps others discover these stories. Now, settle back, dim the lights, and prepare to meet the man who built socialism in one country on a foundation of bones. The revolutionary who became a dictator and, in his own mind at least, almost a god. This is the bedtime biography of Joseph Stalin. Chapter 1. The Boy from Gori. The story begins in a small Georgian town where the truth itself was negotiable. Ioseb Juhashvili entered the world on December 6, 1878, though he'd later trim a year from his life. The official Soviet record would claim 1879. Stalin himself made this decision in the 1920s, already practicing the art of rewriting history on the smallest canvas available, his own birth certificate. Gori sat in the shadow of the Caucasus Mountains, a place where empires had collided for centuries. The town's medieval fortress overlooked narrow streets where Georgian, Armenian, Russian, and Turkish voices mixed in the market squares. Here, among the cobblestones and Orthodox churches, legends sprouted about young So-So's parentage. Some whispered he was the bastard son of a local prince. Others claimed Emperor Alexander III himself had fathered the child during some improbable Georgian adventure. The truth was both simpler and harder. His mother, Keek, worked her fingers raw as a washerwoman. His father Beso made boots and drank. But Beso wasn't the simple brute that Soviet hagiography would later paint. The man could read Georgian, spoke Russian, Armenian, and Turkish. In his better years, he ran a successful workshop with apprentices and steady orders. The family lived in a brick house with a cellar and wine storage. They weren't wealthy, but they weren't starving either. Soso was their third attempt at a child. The first two boys had died before their first birthdays, making him precious cargo in his mother's eyes. Then came the unraveling. Beso's drinking intensified. The workshop failed. The beatings started. One friend remembered Beso grabbing little Soso by the legs and hurling him to the floor so hard that blood pooled in the child's urine for days. Another time, Keke threw herself between them, taking blows meant for her son, until neighbors pulled the drunk cobbler away. Eventually, Beso disappeared entirely, drifting between Tiflis factories, leaving his family to survive on Keke's work, scrubbing other people's laundry. Disease and accident marked the boy as surely as poverty. Smallpox arrived when he was 7, leaving his face cratered like a battlefield map. Then came the carriage accident, or maybe it was a sledge, the stories vary, that mangled his left arm. The local hospital's treatment made things worse. Blood poisoning set in. The arm withered, growing shorter than the right, bending at an awkward angle he'd spent his life trying to hide in photographs. He had another secret too. 2 toes on his left foot were fused together, a detail the Soviet autopsy would confirm decades later. Yet Soso wasn't some Dickensian orphan shuffling through cobwebbed misery. His mother's fierce ambition lifted him above his circumstances. While other boys his age worked in the fields or workshops, he attended school. The Chakviani family, local nobility with a priest in their ranks, took an interest in the bright, scarred boy. Father Cristofor Chakviani pulled strings to get him into the Gori Theological School in 1888. The priest's children tutored him in Russian, opening doors that most Georgian peasant boys never even knew existed. At school, Soso thrived. The records show a model student earning excellent marks in sacred history, Orthodox catechism, and liturgical chant. His voice rang pure in the church choir. He memorized prayers in Old Church Slavonic. The Russian teacher, a disciplinarian the boys called the gendarme, made him a classroom assistant. This was the first taste of authority, however small, and he savored it. Decades later, in 1944, Stalin would remember these schoolmates with unexpected tenderness. He sent money to old friends from Gori, notes written in Georgian and signed with his childhood name. Grisha, he wrote to one, "Accept this small gift from me, yours, Soso." By then he'd already murdered millions, but something in him still remembered being 9 years old and singing in the church choir while his mother watched from the women's section, her calloused hands folded in prayer. Stalin himself would later claim his parents did not treat me badly by any means. A peculiar statement from a man whose father beat him unconscious and whose mother worked herself to exhaustion. But perhaps that's how it seemed to him. Just the normal texture of life in 1880s Georgia, where most families buried half their children and wives, expected bruises. Or perhaps he was already practicing the art he'd perfect as dictator, transforming suffering into strength through sheer force of narrative will. Chapter 2: The Failed Seminarian. September 1894. Soso entered the Tiflis Theological Seminary, carrying his mother's dreams in a small cloth bundle. The building rose like a fortress above the city, all stone corridors and echoing prayers. Here, they would make priests out of Georgian boys, or so the authorities hoped. What they actually created was something else entirely. At first, he flourished. Fifth in his class, by the second year, behavior marked excellent. The teachers nodded approvingly as he recited catechisms in perfect Russian. But the seminary operated like a prison dressed in holy robes. They woke at 7 to bells, prayers before breakfast, prayers before lessons, prayers before the thin soup they called dinner. After 5 o'clock roll call, the doors locked. No one in, no one out. The monks searched their rooms without warning, rifling through belongings for forbidden books or Georgian newspapers. Speaking Georgian earned punishment. Writing in Georgian earned worse. The Russian Empire was civilizing these provincial boys, one prohibited syllable at a time. A classmate remembered the atmosphere. We felt as if we were in prison. The walls pressed closer each day. Soso found his escape in books. Not the holy texts, but novels, smuggled through the seminary's black market of ideas. He discovered Alexandra Kazbegi's The Patricide, a tale of a Georgian noble named Koba who fought Russian oppressors with mountain justice and a sharp blade. The name stuck to him like a shadow. Koba. His friends started calling him that, and he wore it like armor. Poetry poured from him during those early seminary years. 6 pieces published in Georgian newspapers between 1895 and 96. Sweet, earnest verses about motherland and morning light. Blossom, lovely land, he wrote. Exult, country of Georgians. The words seem almost impossibly innocent now, coming from the boy who would starve Ukraine. But poetry wasn't enough. By his 3rd year, he joined an illegal discussion circle where seminarians read Victor Hugo by candlelight. His grades began their slow collapse. The conduct journal filled with infractions, missed prayers, bad behavior during liturgy, returning late from who knows where. He was attending secret meetings with railway workers, discovering Marx's promise that history moved through collision and struggle toward paradise. The inspection records from 1899 tell the story's end. Confined to punishment cells, books confiscated, more infractions piling up. In May, the seminary expelled him for failing to appear at examinations for unknown reasons. The official language disguised what everyone knew. They were eager to be rid of him without scandal. Stalin would later tell a German writer that the seminary's Jesuitical methods had made him a revolutionary. Perhaps, or perhaps he was already inclined toward rebellion, and the seminary simply showed him what to rebel against. Either way, Keke's dream of her son in priest's robes died in those stone corridors. Her Soso walked out of the seminary doors and into the underground, where men plotted by lamplight to tear down the entire world. Chapter 3: The Professional Revolutionary. After the seminary expelled him, Soso took a job at the Tiflis Meteorological Station, recording temperatures and rainfall like any ordinary clerk. But ordinary was never his destination. Soon he vanished into the underground, that shadow world where men lived on false papers and slept in different beds each night. The local police files describe him perfectly, conducting himself with complete caution and constantly looking over his shoulder as he walks. This was the revolutionary's dance, always checking for the police tail, always ready to slip around a corner and disappear. He moved to Batum, the oil port on the Black Sea, where workers' grievances bubbled thick as crude. March 9th, 1902. The strikes he'd helped organize turned into something darker. Troops opened fire on the workers. 13 dead at least, maybe more. Blood mixed with oil in the puddles. The police swept through the city afterward, and they caught him in their net. His first arrest, in his cell, he scribbled notes to relatives, begging for false alibis. He petitioned the authorities about his worsening cough and his poor mother's helpless situation. They weren't moved. Siberia swallowed him for the first time in 1903. Eastern reaches where winter lasted 9 months, and escape meant death by cold if the wolves didn't find you first. But he escaped anyway in early 1904, making his way back to the Caucasus, just as the Social Democrats were tearing themselves in half. Lenin wanted professional revolutionaries, disciplined and ruthless. The Mensheviks wanted something gentler, more democratic. Soso's choice was never in doubt. The 1905 revolution erupted across the empire. He was everywhere and nowhere, setting up printing presses in basements, organizing what he called fighting squads. This work caught Lenin's attention. Soon he was traveling to party congresses in Stockholm and London, meeting the leader himself in Berlin. They talked through the night about the beautiful violence that would birth a new world. June 1907. His friend Kamo and some others robbed a bank transport in Tiflis's main square. 250,000 rubles for the party coffers. 40 people dead. The author of our story concludes Stalin knew about it, helped hide it from local comrades, but didn't plan it himself. Still, the heat from that robbery forced him to flee to Baku, where he disappeared into the oil fields' perpetual twilight. The arrests came regularly now. 1908, 1910. Each time, rumors followed him back from prison. Was he a police agent? The author dismisses this, noting the key evidence was later exposed as forgery. But the suspicion clung to him like oil smoke. By 1912, he'd joined Lenin's Central Committee, close enough to power to taste it. He'd also chosen a new name for his articles, not Koba anymore, something harder, more Russian. Stalin, Man of Steel. Chapter 4: The Siberian Limbo. February 1913. The police came for Stalin one last time. The betrayer was Roman Malinovsky, a fellow Bolshevik who reported every secret to the Okhrana. They sentenced Stalin to 4 years in Turakansky Krai, a place so remote that maps sometimes forgot to include it. The Arctic Circle loomed just north, and winter temperatures dropped to 37 below. His letters from those first months read like messages from a drowning man. "The cold intensifies," he wrote. "I have a suspicious cough, no money for bread or kerosene. My hardship grows by the hour. I'm in a desperate situation. I can't stand it any longer." The party tried to organize his escape, but Malinovsky whispered their plans to the police before they could unfold. March 1914. They moved him even deeper into nowhere, a village called Kureka, where the sun disappeared for months and the river froze solid enough to drive sledges across. His companion in exile was Yakov Sverdlov, another Bolshevik who believed in revolution and clean dishes. They lasted about 3 weeks as housemates. The problem was the dog. Stalin had adopted a local mutt named Yashka, who followed him everywhere. After meals, Stalin would set his plates on the dirt floor and let Yashka lick them clean. This was frontier efficiency. Sverdlov saw it differently. That fellow had a passion for cleanliness, Stalin recalled years later, still amused by the memory. Sverdlov called him too much of an individualist in practical matters. They moved into separate houses and stopped speaking entirely. With Sverdlov gone, Stalin moved in with the Pereprigin family. Soon he was sharing more than their cabin. Lydia Pereprigina was 14 years old when their relationship began. The local policeman, an ethnic Ossetian like Stalin, looked the other way. When Stalin got into a fistfight with his guard over the girl, the policeman took Stalin's side and assigned him a friendlier guard named Merzlyakov, for whom Stalin would later write glowing recommendations. The days blurred together, fishing through holes in the ice, setting traps for rabbits, sharing vodka with locals who'd forgotten why they'd been exiled in the first place. He'd brought books initially, but they gathered dust. No articles flowed from his pen, no letters to the party leadership. Trotsky would later search for traces of Stalin's intellectual life during this period, and find nothing but silence. By 1915, Lenin had forgotten his exiled comrade so completely that he sent notes to colleagues asking, "Do you remember Koba's last name?" "We've forgotten." The future dictator had dissolved into the Siberian whiteness, becoming just another exile, counting days until 1917. He wrote one last letter to Malinovsky, still not knowing the man was a traitor, swearing on his dog's life that he would serve out his term. This was Stalin's deepest disappearance, his most complete erasure from history's stage. While Europe tore itself apart in the Great War, while Lenin wrote furious pamphlets in Swiss cafes, Stalin sat by a smoky fire in Kureka, playing cards with his guard and waiting for winter to end. The man of steel had become a ghost, haunting a place that barely existed, forgotten by everyone who mattered, until revolution came and changed everything. Chapter 5. The Revolution of 1917. February 1917 arrived like a fever breaking. The Tsar abdicated. The empire collapsed. Stalin heard the news in Kureka and immediately started packing. No need to wait for official release papers. Russia had bigger problems now. He caught rides on sledges and riverboats, racing toward Petrograd, where history was being written by the hour. He arrived to find the Bolsheviks in disarray. Lenin was still in Switzerland. The party's Petrograd leaders were stumbling through events without clear direction. Stalin and his old friend Kamenev took control of Pravda, the party newspaper, and immediately steered it toward moderation. They wrote that Russia needed to pass through proper capitalist development before socialism could bloom, support the provisional government conditionally, continue the war defensively. This was orthodox Marxism, sensible and gradual. Then Lenin's letters started arriving from exile, each one more radical than the last. No support for the bourgeois government, immediate peace, all power to the Soviets. Stalin and Kamenev thought their leader had lost touch with reality. They edited his articles before publishing them, softening the sharp edges, adding qualifiers where Lenin had written absolutes. They were trying to save him from himself. April 3rd. Lenin's train pulled into Finland station. The crowd went wild, but the speech he gave that night stunned even his own party. His April theses demanded immediate socialist revolution, right now, no waiting for history's permission. The Bolshevik leadership listened in bewilderment. One old comrade muttered that Lenin had gone mad. Stalin sat silent, calculating. Within days, Stalin pivoted completely. At the April Party conference, Lenin personally endorsed him. "We have known Comrade Koba for very many years. He handles any responsible job well." Stalin secured his spot on the Central Committee and promptly abandoned every moderate position he'd held the week before. He called it creative Marxism. Rules were for people who wanted to lose. "We must reject the obsolete notion that only Europe can show us the way," he declared, as if he'd never thought otherwise. Summer 1917. The July days erupted in street demonstrations that nearly destroyed the Bolsheviks. The government blamed them for the chaos. Lenin fled to Finland. Kamenev was arrested. Stalin, less famous and thus less wanted, stayed free and useful. He arranged Lenin's hiding places, moving him between safe houses like a chess piece one step ahead of the police. October approached. The party split over whether to seize power. Zinoviev and Kamenev went public with their opposition, warning that insurrection meant civil war. Lenin exploded, demanding their expulsion. But Stalin defended them in Pravda, writing that despite disagreements, overall, we remain like-minded. It was a rare moment of defying Lenin, choosing old friendships over revolutionary purity. Meanwhile, Trotsky had emerged as the revolution's brilliant star, organizing the Military Revolutionary Committee, giving speeches that set crowds on fire. Stalin watched from the shadows, learning when the Winter Palace fell on October 25th. Stalin wasn't leading any charges. He was in a room somewhere, editing copy for the next day's paper. But he'd learned Lenin's essential lesson. In revolutionary moments, the most radical position usually wins. Moderation was death. Extremism was survival. He would never forget it. Chapter 6. Forged in Civil War. The October Revolution was just the overture. What followed was 3 years of civil war that killed 8 million people through combat, starvation, and disease. 4 times what Russia lost in the Great War. This was the furnace that forged Stalin into something harder than his revolutionary dreams ever imagined. Summer 1918. The Bolsheviks sent Stalin to Tsaritsyn to procure grain for starving Moscow. He found the city under siege and immediately exceeded his orders. He seized military command, though he'd never led troops. He dismissed the professional officers Trotsky had sent, calling them lifeless pen pushers and cobblers in furious telegrams to Lenin. These former Tsarist officers knew how to fight, but Stalin trusted his drinking buddy Clement Voroshilov more than any military academy graduate. When his amateur tactics nearly lost the city, Stalin discovered his signature move. He invented a conspiracy. Secret enemies had sabotaged them from within. The arrests began immediately. Former officers, engineers, anyone with soft hands and clean fingernails. They dragged an engineer named Alexeyev into the basement of the secret police headquarters. A fellow prisoner, Konstantin Makhrovsky, later described finding Alexeyev with his face totally covered by a mask of blood, guards beating him with rifle butts and boots even after he'd collapsed. Stalin ordered a prison barge anchored in the Volga. 400 people packed inside with one latrine and no food. Some went mad from thirst. Others threw themselves into the river. Stalin and Voroshilov took credit for every execution, sending proud reports to Moscow about their vigilance against counter-revolution. When the real military situation grew desperate, they simply shot more traitors and requested more ammunition. Trotsky, building his professional Red Army, watched this chaos with growing alarm. On October 4th, he telegraphed Lenin, "I categorically insist that Stalin be recalled. We have a colossal superiority of forces, but total anarchy at the top." Stalin fired back that Trotsky was protecting traitors from among military specialists. The two men would never forgive each other for what happened in Tsaritsyn. But Stalin learned something valuable in that blood-soaked city. Competence was optional if you had enough bullets. Failure could always be blamed on hidden enemies. Terror could substitute for talent. These weren't just emergency measures for wartime. They were tools he would carry forever. The Civil War created the Soviet state's DNA. Not the workers' paradise Lenin had promised in his Swiss exile, but something harder and more desperate. Every institution was militarized. Every disagreement became potential treason. The Cheka, the secret police, executed more people in 3 years than the Tsarist regime had in the previous century. This wasn't an aberration. It was the foundation. Stalin thrived in this atmosphere like a cave fish in darkness. While Trotsky commanded armies and Lenin wrote theoretical justifications for the terror, Stalin did the dirty work others avoided. He supervised grain requisitions that left peasants starving. He ordered the execution of former comrades who'd chosen the wrong side. He learned that revolution wasn't about ideal. It was about who could be most ruthless when ruthlessness mattered. The boy from Gori who'd written poetry about blossoming motherlands was gone. What emerged from the Civil War was something else entirely. Chapter 7. The Grey Blur. After the Civil War ended, Stalin held 2 seemingly minor posts. He ran the Nationalities Commissariat and the Workers' and Peasants' Inspectorate. Neither job commanded armies or crowds, but power in the new Soviet state wasn't always where it appeared to be. The real game was being played between Lenin and Trotsky. By late 1920, Lenin grew nervous about Trotsky's influence in the party machinery. Stalin picked his side without hesitation. He helped Lenin orchestrate a purge of Trotsky's supporters at the 10th Party Congress in 1921. Loyalty like that earned rewards. April 1922. Lenin was already feeling the first touches of the illness that would kill him. He needed someone to manage the party's daily operations, someone reliable and methodical. He created a new position, General Secretary of the Central Committee. The job sounded bureaucratic, almost boring. Stalin accepted it quietly. From this gray office, Stalin controlled everything that mattered. He set Politburo agendas. He managed personnel appointments across the entire Soviet Union. Tens of thousands of officials suddenly owed their positions to his signature. His assistant, a Mayak Nazarisian, wrote letters describing Stalin's firm hand and cunning nature. Hard as a nut, Nazardian marveled. It takes a while to understand what he's up to. A new phrase entered Moscow slang for officials awaiting assignments: going under Stalin. While Trotsky gave speeches that made crowds roar, and Lenin wrote brilliant articles from his sickbed, Stalin sat in his office, moving names around on lists. Each name was a debt. Each debt was a vote. The party apparatus was becoming his personal machine, one appointment at a time. His relationship with Lenin during this period was extraordinarily intimate. They shared jokes about Stalin's pipe smoking, Lenin calling him an Asian with affection. When Lenin's health collapsed in May 1922, he summoned Stalin with a terrible request. He wanted poison. The paralysis was coming, and Lenin preferred death to helplessness. Stalin refused gently, telling Lenin the doctors were still hopeful. "Are you being deceitful?" Lenin asked. Stalin replied, "When have you ever seen me be deceitful?" It was a moment of genuine tenderness between two men who'd shed rivers of blood together. Lenin's sister Maria later confirmed this story, one of the few times Stalin showed something approaching compassion. But even as Stalin played the loyal lieutenant, he was building something Lenin never intended. The party secretary was supposed to be a clerk, not a king. Yet every day, Stalin's control grew stronger. He knew who drank too much, who had bourgeois parents, who'd supported the Mensheviks in 1905. Information was ammunition, and he was stockpiling enough to fight a war. The other Bolshevik leaders dismissed him as a gray blur, someone important enough to attend meetings but not brilliant enough to matter. They spent their time debating theory and writing position papers. Stalin spent his time learning where every single party member's loyalty resided. They were playing chess. He was buying the board. When Lenin's health finally failed completely, the gray blur would emerge from the shadows, and everyone would discover they already belonged to him. Chapter 8: The Break with Lenin. Fall 1922. The partnership between Lenin and Stalin began to crack like ice under Spring Sunday. Lenin, watching from his sickbed, grew alarmed at how much power his general secretary had accumulated. The filing cabinets full of personnel records had become an empire. The first real fight erupted over the formation of the Soviet Union itself. Stalin wanted to absorb Ukraine, Belarus, and the Transcaucasian republics directly into Russia. He called it autonomization. Lenin read the proposal and exploded. This was great Russian chauvinism, he said. The Tsarist Empire wearing red clothes. Stalin told Kamenev they should stand up to Ilyich. But when Lenin stood firm, Stalin retreated. You didn't win fights with Lenin. Not yet. Then came the foreign trade monopoly dispute. Stalin wanted to loosen it. Lenin wanted it ironclad. To everyone's surprise, Lenin formed an alliance with Trotsky, his old rival. In a note to his wife, Krupskaya, Lenin urged Trotsky not to stop, but to continue the offensive. They were planning something together, these two giants, and Stalin was the target. Stalin found out about the secret communications. He telephoned Krupskaya and unleashed a stream of abuse. How dare she let Lenin work on politics when the Politburo had ordered rest? The call lasted 4 minutes. Krupskaya was left shaking. She'd been Lenin's partner since before Stalin could grow a proper moustache, and now this Georgian clerk was screaming at her. December 24th, 1922. Lenin dictated what history would call his testament. Comrade Stalin, he warned, has concentrated immense power in his hands, and I am not sure whether he will always be capable of exercising this power with sufficient caution. It was diplomatic language for a political death sentence. 10 days later, Lenin added a postscript with the gloves off. Stalin was too rude, he wrote. The party should think about a way of removing Stalin from that post. He cited the Georgian affair, where Stalin had bullied the local communists, and the vicious call to Krupskaya. This wasn't about policy anymore. It was personal. March 5th, 1923, Lenin prepared his final assault. He asked Trotsky to defend the Georgian communists at the upcoming party congress. The same day, he dictated a letter to Stalin that could have been written in acid. Apologize to my wife, or I will break off relations with you. He sent messages to the Georgian opposition expressing support and condemning Stalin's connivances. Stalin was trapped. Lenin and Trotsky united against him meant political extinction. But 3 days later, salvation arrived in the form of a massive stroke, Lenin's third and most devastating. It left him speechless, half paralyzed, a prisoner in his own body. He would live another 10 months, but never speak another political word. The bullets were fired, but the target had moved. Stalin survived because Lenin's body betrayed him at exactly the right moment. Sometimes history turns on such accidents. A blood vessel bursts in an old revolutionary's brain, and a different future begins to form. Lenin had identified the danger perfectly, but his warning would become just another document for Stalin to bury in those filing cabinets he controlled so completely. Chapter 9. Outmaneuvering Rivals. Lenin died in January 1924, leaving behind a party that supposedly believed in collective leadership. In reality, the knives were already out. The main players circled each other. Trotsky with his brilliant speeches, Zinoviev and Kamenev with their old revolutionary credentials, and Stalin with his filing cabinets full of secrets. Stalin's opponents didn't underestimate him. They just feared Trotsky more. The war commissar who'd built the Red Army seemed the obvious successor to Lenin. So Zinoviev and Kamenev made a deal with the devil they thought they knew. They formed a ruling troika with Stalin to keep Trotsky from power. It was the mistake that would destroy them. May 1924. The 13th Party Congress, Lenin's testament, was read to senior delegates in a closed session. The words hung in the air: remove Stalin from his post. This was Lenin speaking from beyond the grave, and everyone knew it. Stalin sat silent while his fate was debated. Then Zinoviev stood up. Stalin had heard Lenin's criticism, he argued. The man would surely correct his behavior. Kamenev agreed. They couldn't risk strengthening Trotsky by removing Stalin now. The delegates, desperate to avoid more conflict, voted to suppress Lenin's last wish. Stalin remained General Secretary. He'd remember who saved him and exactly when to forget that debt. By July, Zinoviev was already writing panicked letters to Kamenev. There is no troika, he wrote. There is only Stalin's dictatorship. Ilyich was 1,000 times right. But it was too late to close the door they'd opened. Stalin had already begun undermining them, building alliances with the party's right wing, particularly Nikolai Bukharin and Alexei Rykov. August 1924. Stalin submitted a theatrical resignation letter asking to be sent to Turakansky Krai, Yakutsk Oblast, or abroad. It was pure performance, testing his support. The Central Committee refused the resignation immediately. He learned he was now too essential to remove. Zinoviev and Kamenev found themselves boxed in. To oppose Stalin's new moderate economic policies, they had to adopt Trotsky's leftist platform, the same positions they'd attacked him for just months earlier. They looked like opportunists, which they were. At the 14th Party Congress in December 1925, Stalin crushed them completely. He sent his loyalist Sergei Kirov to take over Zinoviev's power base in Leningrad. The city's entire party apparatus was purged and replaced with Stalin's people. Desperate, Zinoviev and Kamenev made one last move. They formed a united opposition with their old enemy Trotsky in 1926. Former rivals united against the common threat. Stalin responded by using the secret police to brand them as an illegal organization. Their supporters were arrested. Provocateurs disrupted their meetings. By the end of 1927, Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev were all expelled from the Central Committee. Trotsky would be exiled to Alma-Ata, then expelled from the Soviet Union entirely. The grey blur had devoured them all. While they debated theory and made speeches, he'd been collecting people like chess pieces. Now the board belonged to him. Only the right wing remained. And Stalin was already planning their destruction too. He'd learned from watching Lenin. In politics, yesterday's essential ally is tomorrow's enemy. Keep the knife sharp and the hand steady. Chapter 10. The Great Turn. With the left opposition destroyed, Stalin turned on his own allies. Bukharin, Rykov, and Tomsky had helped him crush Trotsky, thinking they'd earned partnership. They were about to learn that Stalin collected allies like ammunition to be fired when needed and discarded when spent. The excuse came wrapped in grain statistics. 1927 brought a procurement crisis. Peasants weren't selling enough grain to feed the cities and fund industrialization. Bukharin and Rykov wanted patience, market incentives, gentle persuasion. Stalin saw opportunity. He'd been waiting for the right moment to pivot left, to steal the defeated opposition's platform and make it his own. January 1928. Stalin boarded a train for Siberia. He bypassed Rykov's government entirely, acting like the state was already his personal property. In meeting rooms across the frozen provinces, he gathered local party officials and gave them new orders. Forget persuasion. Apply Article 107 of the Criminal Code, the one about speculation. Any peasant refusing to sell grain at state prices was now a criminal. Press, beat, he told them. That became the motto whispered in government offices. Officials who'd spent years coaxing grain from villages now kicked down doors and emptied barns at gunpoint. It was war communism returning the violence of 1919 dressed up in legal language. Stalin called it extraordinary measures. The peasants called it robbery. To justify this sharp turn toward violence, Stalin needed enemies. He found them everywhere. Mid-1928 brought the Shakti affair, the first great show trial. 53 engineers accused of sabotaging mines and factories. The charges were absurd, the confessions beaten out of them, but the spectacle served its purpose. If engineers were wrecking socialism, then extreme measures were justified. Stalin unveiled his new theory at party meetings. As socialism approached, he explained, class struggle would intensify. Enemies would grow more desperate. Violence would increase, not decrease. This turned Marxism upside down. But who would dare point that out? The theory meant Stalin could justify any brutality as historical necessity. Bukharin saw the trap closing. In July 1928, he made a desperate, foolish move. He met secretly with the disgraced Kamenev, pouring out his fears about Stalin. "He will strangle us all," Bukharin whispered. Someone, probably Stalin's agents, stole notes from this meeting. Soon, everyone knew about Bukharin's conspiracy with former oppositionists. Stalin dismantled his rivals' power bases methodically. Tomsky's trade unions experienced sudden rebellions from below, all mysteriously well organized. Uglanov lost control of the Moscow party organization to carefully orchestrated coups. By April 1929, Bukharin, Rykov, and Tomsky were formally condemned as right deviationists. November 1929, Stalin stood before the Central Committee and announced the end of the new economic policy. No more gradualism, no more compromise. The Soviet Union would collectivize agriculture immediately and completely. It would industrialize at breakneck speed. Anyone who disagreed was an enemy of history itself. The last pretense of collective leadership died in that room. Stalin had outmaneuvered them all, the brilliant ones and the brutal ones alike. He'd used each faction to destroy the others, then destroyed the survivors with their own weapons. Now he stood alone at the summit, ready to reshape 1/6 of the Earth's surface according to his will. The revolution was about to devour its own children, and Stalin would hold the knife. Chapter 11. War on the Peasants. November 1929. Stalin announced the immediate collectivization of Soviet agriculture. Not gradually, not voluntarily, but now and by force. 25 million peasant families would be herded onto collective farms whether they wanted it or not. The next month, he declared something even darker, the liquidation of the kulaks as a class. Kulak meant fist in Russian, supposedly the rich peasants who exploited their neighbors. But Stalin's definition expanded like spilled ink. Anyone with 2 cows was a kulak. Anyone who hired help during harvest, anyone who resisted collectivization, the word became a death sentence that could be applied to anyone. Tens of thousands of urban activists poured into the countryside that winter. They came like an invading army, knowing nothing about farming but everything about force. Their weapon was simple: join the collective farm or be branded a kulak. Lose everything. Face exile to Siberia. Maybe face a bullet. The collectivization rate tells the story in numbers. October 1929, 7.5% of households. February 1930, 52%. 4 months to destroy a way of life that stretched back centuries. Peasants woke to find their grain confiscated, their tools declared communal property, their livestock driven into collective herds. The countryside exploded. 1930 saw nearly 14,000 instances of mass unrest. 3.5 million peasants rose up, especially in Ukraine, which accounted for almost half the rebellions. They rang church bells to summon neighboring villages. They took back their grain and animals. They dismantled the collective farms with their bare hands. Stalin sent Ordzhonikidze to investigate. His report was clinical. Armed forces using machine guns and in some places cannons. There are 100 killed and shot and a few hundred wounded. When the Ukrainian security chief asked for guidance, Stalin's response was brief: act more decisively. The rebellions were crushed village by village, but the spring planting season was approaching, and without crops, even Stalin would starve. March 2nd, 1930, Stalin published Dizzy with Success in Pravda, a masterpiece of political cynicism. The excesses of collectivization, he wrote, came from local officials who'd gotten carried away. They'd become dizzy with success. It wasn't his policy that was wrong, just these foolish subordinates who'd misunderstood. The peasants could leave the collective farms if they wished. They fled in millions. By May, collectivization had dropped back to 23%. The peasants planted their spring crops, as they always had, on their own small plots. But Stalin was only buying time. Once the harvest was safely gathered, the assault resumed. By the end of 1931, the majority were trapped in the collective system again. The human cost was staggering. Families torn apart, entire villages emptied to Siberia. Between 1928 and 1933, the cattle population fell from 60 million to 33 million. Peasants slaughtered their animals rather than surrender them. Better to eat meat tonight than give it to Stalin tomorrow. This was revolution from above, imposed by urban communists who'd never touched soil. They destroyed the most productive farmers, the ones who knew how to make things grow. What followed would be catastrophe on a scale even Stalin might not have imagined. Though, knowing what we know about him now, perhaps he imagined it perfectly. Chapter 12. The Terror Famine. The collective farms were machines designed to fail. Peasants who'd farmed their own plots for generations now worked communal fields with no stake in the harvest. They knew the state would take everything anyway. So they worked slowly, carelessly, sometimes not at all. By 1932, the inevitable had arrived. Famine. This wasn't nature's cruelty. The author makes this absolutely clear. Stalin created this catastrophe through policy, then deepened it through choice. 5 to 7 million people would die, mostly in Ukraine and the North Caucasus, the regions that had resisted collectivization most fiercely. Stalin saw starvation as a weapon, and he wielded it precisely. The writer Mikhail Sholokhov sent Stalin a letter describing what he'd seen in the villages. Peasants tortured to reveal hidden grain, mock executions, hot irons pressed against skin. He wrote about a woman with a baby expelled from her home for failing to meet her quota. She wandered the village through the night, begging to be let inside. No one dared help her. By morning, the infant had frozen to death in her arms. Stalin read the letter and responded with ice in his veins. The peasants were waging a quiet war against Soviet power, he wrote back. A war by starvation. They were the aggressors, not the victims. In his mind, Ukrainian peasants were doubly suspect. They were peasants, which made them backward. They were Ukrainian, which made them nationalist. Their suffering was therefore both deserved and useful. Procurement brigades swept through dying villages like locusts. They took not just grain, but everything edible. Potatoes, beets, seeds for next year's planting. They probed the ground with metal rods, searching for buried food, the yamas that families had hidden to survive. Finding one meant arrest, maybe execution. The brigades left nothing behind but hunger. Secret police reports from 1933 describe scenes from hell. Parents eating their dead children, children eating their parents. Entire villages where no living thing moved. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union exported 1.8 million tons of grain in 1932. The grain that could have saved millions went to buy foreign machinery for Stalin's factories. Refugees tried to flee to regions where food still existed. Stalin ordered police cordons around the famine zones. Anyone caught leaving was sent back to die. The cities needed to be protected from hungry peasants who might tell their stories. Better they die quietly in their villages, out of sight. February 1933. The famine reached its peak. Stalin delivered a speech about the achievements of collectivization. The poor peasants, he declared, had attained material security in the collective farms. While millions starved, he celebrated their prosperity. When an American visitor mentioned the famine privately, Stalin admitted some peasants were currently hungry, but blamed them for being parasites and idlers. This was power without conscience. Stalin had learned during the Civil War that violence worked. Now he'd discovered something worse. Hunger was cheaper than bullets and quieter than executions. It could destroy millions while leaving buildings intact. The bodies could be plowed under, and next year's grain would grow from soil enriched by the dead. He'd found the perfect crime, one that left no fingerprints except on history itself. Chapter 13. Rehearsal for Terror. December 1st, 1934. Sergei Kirov walked through the corridors of the Smolny Institute in Leningrad, the old finishing school where the Bolsheviks had planned their revolution. A young man named Leonid Nikolaev waited in the hallway, one shot to the back of the neck. Kirov was dead before he hit the floor. For decades, people have whispered that Stalin ordered the hit. Kirov was popular, charismatic, everything Stalin wasn't. The author examines the evidence carefully and concludes there's no proof Stalin arranged the murder. Nikolaev was unstable, recently expelled from the party, carrying grievances like stones in his pocket. Sometimes a lone gunman is just a lone gunman. But Stalin turned Kirov's corpse into a ladder. Within hours, he was on a train to Leningrad, playing the grieving comrade while orchestrating the investigation. He told Security Chief Yezhov exactly what to find. Look for murderers among the Zinovievites, he ordered. Not investigate, not discover. Look for them where Stalin had already decided they existed. The old oppositionists were rounded up. Zinoviev and Kamenev, already defeated politically, now faced criminal charges. There was no evidence connecting them to Nikolaev. Stalin didn't need evidence. He needed a narrative. Kirov had been killed by a vast conspiracy of former oppositionists, terrorists, hiding behind party cards. The trials began immediately. December 1934, January 1935, dozens of alleged Zinovievites were shot or sent to camps. But Stalin wasn't just punishing past opposition. He was establishing precedent. Political disagreement was now terrorism. Yesterday's debate was tomorrow's death sentence. The Kirov tributary, as it became known, spread beyond the opposition. Thousands of former nobles, priests, and Tsarist officials were swept from Leningrad and exiled. The city had to be cleansed of unreliable elements. Anyone with the wrong background, the wrong connections, the wrong thoughts, the security organs were learning to cast wide nets. Yet, Stalin mixed terror with calculated moderation. In 1935, he announced a new Soviet constitution, the most democratic in the world, he claimed. He declared that sons wouldn't answer for their father's crimes anymore. He even invited some exiled kulaks to return home. These signals confused everyone, which was exactly the point. The security apparatus kept perfecting its methods. Show trials became theatrical productions. Defendants confessed to impossible crimes with rehearsed precision. They'd met with Trotsky on days he was provably elsewhere. They'd sabotaged factories that didn't exist. Truth became irrelevant. The performance was everything. This was the rehearsal period. Stalin was testing the machinery of terror, checking its gears and springs. Could the party be made to believe obvious lies? Yes. Would old revolutionaries confess to being foreign spies? With enough pressure? Yes. Would anyone dare defend the accused? No one did. By 1936, the rehearsals were ending. Stalin had learned what he needed. The state could manufacture any reality it chose. Former heroes could become traitors overnight. The impossible could become historical fact if repeated enough times. The stage was set for something unprecedented in human history. Not just terror, but total terror. Not just control, but absolute control. The Great Terror was coming, and Kirov's murder had shown Stalin exactly how to conduct it. Chapter 14. The Great Terror. Summer 1937. Stalin unleashed hell with a bureaucrat's precision. NKVD Order Number 00447 arrived at security offices across the Soviet Union on July 30th. It contained quotas, region by region, numbers to be shot, numbers for the camps, like a production plan for death. The initial targets were the usual suspects: former kulaks back from exile, ex-priests, members of other political parties from before the revolution, common criminals. But the quotas could be exceeded, and local officials, eager to show their vigilance, overfulfilled them with enthusiasm. If Moscow wanted 1,000 enemies found, they'd find 2,000. Parallel to this came the national operations: Poles, Germans, Latvians, Finns, entire ethnicities branded as breeding grounds for spies. Stalin's logic was paranoid but simple. War was coming with Germany and Japan. The Spanish Civil War had shown him how fifth columns operated behind the lines. Better to kill 100,000 potential traitors than risk one real one. He explained it in a speech that year. Building a railway bridge takes thousands of workers. Blowing it up takes 3 people with dynamite. Therefore, the 3 must be found and destroyed before they even think about dynamite. Find them among the Poles. Find them among former officers. Find them everywhere. The archives reveal Stalin's handwriting all over the terror. He read interrogation reports daily, scrawling instructions in the margins. Beat Unschlich for not naming the Polish agents. Just that. Beat him. Beat Walter. Keep on digging and cleaning out this Polish spy filth. His pen authorized torture as casually as signing a memo. Between 1937 and 38, approximately 1.6 million people were arrested. 700,000 were shot. That's 1,500 executions every single day for 18 months. The killing happened in forests, basements, prison yards, trucks running their engines to drown out the gunshots. Bodies trucked away in the darkness. The party devoured itself. The 17th Party Congress, delegates, the ones who cheered Stalin in 1934, were almost entirely eliminated. The Red Army's command structure was destroyed in the Tukhachevsky affair. Marshal Tukhachevsky and his fellow officers were accused of working with German intelligence. The evidence was forged, but they died anyway. The army that would soon face Hitler lost most of its experienced commanders. Every institution was gutted. Scientists, writers, engineers, doctors. The director of the Moscow Zoo was shot as a wrecker. How does one wreck a zoo? it didn't matter. The accusations had their own logic. If someone was arrested, they must be guilty. If they were guilty, their colleagues must be guilty too. The circles widened endlessly. Late 1938, Stalin suddenly stopped the terror. Like turning off a faucet, he arrested Yezhov, the security chief who'd carried out his orders, and had him shot for excesses. The period became known as the Yezhovshchina, Yezhov's time, as if Stalin had been an innocent bystander to his own massacre. The Great Terror achieved its purpose. Every potential alternative to Stalin was dead or broken. A new generation of officials had risen, owing everything to him. They'd participated in the killing, making them complicit. The Soviet Union was now populated by people who'd learned to denounce their neighbors to survive. Stalin had created the perfect totalitarian state, held together by shared guilt and mutual fear. Chapter 15. The Generalissimo. August 23rd, 1939. The world turned upside down. Joachim von Ribbentrop landed in Moscow to sign a pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The two ideological enemies, who'd spent years denouncing each other as the ultimate evil, were suddenly partners. Stalin raised his glass at the reception. I know how much the German nation loves its Führer. I should therefore like to drink to his health. The secret protocols carved up Eastern Europe like a wedding cake. Poland would be split down the middle. The Baltic states would fall into Stalin's sphere. Finland, part of Romania, all promised to Moscow. Stalin had bought time to prepare for the war he knew was coming, while gaining territory without firing a shot. When Hitler invaded Poland on September 1st, Stalin waited 17 days, then sent his troops to claim the Soviet share. For 22 months, the partnership held. Soviet grain and oil flowed to Germany. German technology came back. Stalin deported or executed Polish officers at Katyn Forest. 22,000 men shot in the back of the head. He absorbed the Baltic states through rigged elections. When warnings came about German invasion plans, he dismissed them all as British provocations designed to drag him into war. June 21st, 1941. A German sergeant named Alfred Liskow swam across the Bug River and surrendered to Soviet guards. The invasion begins at dawn, he said. Stalin read the report and scoffed. Could it be that the German generals sent us this defector to provoke a clash? When more warnings arrived, he issued minimal defensive orders. Don't provoke the Germans. Maybe this was all a misunderstanding. 4 a.m., June 22nd. The phone rang in Stalin's Dachau. Zhukov reported German planes bombing Soviet cities, tanks crossing borders. Stalin said nothing, just breathing on the line. Finally, this is a provocation by the German military. Do not open fire to avoid unleashing wider action. He still couldn't believe his partner had betrayed him. By noon, The scale of catastrophe was undeniable. 1,200 Soviet planes destroyed, most never leaving the ground. German armies advancing 60 kilometers into the Baltic states, 40 into Belarus. When Foreign Minister Schulenburg delivered Germany's declaration of war, citing threats to their eastern border, Molotov could only stammer. Why did Germany sign a non-aggression pact only to break it so easily? Stalin refused to address the nation. He sat in his office, growing smaller somehow. Zhukov later remembered. The shock to Stalin caused by the enemy invasion was so strong that his voice even became softer. Molotov gave the famous radio address instead. Our cause is just. The enemy will be crushed. Victory will be ours. Empty words while the frontier armies disintegrated. June 29th. News arrived that Minsk had fallen. Stalin visited the Defense Commissariat, exploded at his generals. What kind of general staff is this? What kind of chief of staff? Zhukov burst into tears and ran to another room. Stalin left, telling his companions, "Lenin left us a great legacy. We, his heirs, have pissed it all away." Then he disappeared to his dacha for 2 days. The Politburo found him on June 30th, sitting in an armchair, looking somehow shrunken. When they proposed forming a state defense committee with him as chairman, he seemed surprised they weren't there to arrest him. He accepted, slowly returning to himself. On July 3rd, he finally addressed the nation. "Comrades, citizens, brothers and sisters." Not the usual formal greeting. This was a plea. This is a matter of life and death of the Soviet state. The disasters continued through 1941. In September, Stalin refused to evacuate Kiev, despite obvious encirclement. 450,000 Soviet troops were trapped. He later admitted to Zhukov, "Your report back then was accurate, but I did not understand it correctly." By October, with Germans approaching Moscow, he sat alone in his office, food untouched. "What are we going to do?" he asked whoever would listen. "What are we going to do?" October 15th. Panic gripped Moscow. Officials fled, burning documents. Workers looted shops. Stalin nearly evacuated but decided to stay. On November 7th, he held the traditional Revolution Day parade in Red Square, despite recent bombing. German armies were 40 kilometers away, but Stalin promised the troops that Hitler's Germany would collapse within a year. 1942 brought order number 227, not one step back. Panic mongers and cowards would be shot on sight. Penalty battalions formed from disgraced soldiers sent to die in the most dangerous attacks. From January to October, 5.5 million Red Army soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Stalin was learning generalship through an ocean of blood. Stalingrad changed everything. November 19th, the counteroffensive began. By February 2nd, 1943, Paulus's entire army had surrendered. Then came Kursk in July, the largest tank battle in history. Stalin even visited the front, his only such visit ordering celebratory artillery salutes for liberated cities. At Tehran, in November 1943, Stalin met Churchill and Roosevelt as an equal. He secured promises for a second front in France, which finally came on D-Day, June 6, 1944. By July, he was parading 57,000 German prisoners through Moscow's streets, washing the pavement clean behind them. The Berlin offensive began April 16, 1945. Stalin pushed it forward a month early, accepting 360,000 casualties to take the Nazi capital before the Americans arrived. When Hitler's suicide was confirmed on May 1st, Stalin seemed almost disappointed. "So the bastard's dead. Pity we couldn't take him alive." At Potsdam in July, Stalin stood as one of the Big Three, carving up the post-war world. The boy from Gori had become master of half of Europe, but victory hadn't softened him. Returning from conquered Berlin, he told his inner circle that gratitude was a dog's disease. The generals who'd won his war would soon learn what that meant. The camps were already preparing new spaces for the heroes of Stalingrad and Berlin. Chapter 16. Forging the Iron Curtain. Victory hadn't brought peace. Millions of Soviet soldiers had seen Europe, its cities and farms intact, despite the war. They'd seen how people lived without collective farms, without constant fear. They came home expecting something better after all the blood. Stalin saw this hope as poison that needed immediate antidote. November 1945. Stalin coined a new crime, kowtowing to the West. A ruthless fight must be waged, he declared, against obsequiousness toward foreigners. The campaign would teach Soviet citizens that everything good came from Russia. Everything foreign was corrupt. Russian scientists had invented the radio, not Marconi. Russians had discovered everything worth discovering. The West offered only decay. August 1946. The cultural terror began. Stalin's enforcer Andrei Zdanov attacked 2 Leningrad literary magazines for publishing ideologically impure work. The targets were carefully chosen. Mikhail Zoshenko, beloved satirist, was denounced for spreading brutish hostility. Anna Akhmatova, perhaps Russia's greatest living poet, was called a whore and a nun, in whom licentiousness is combined with prayer. The Zhirdanovshchina, as it became known, spread through every cultural institution. Writers, composers, filmmakers, all faced judgment. Shostakovich and Prokofiev were condemned for formalism. Their music too complex for the masses. Scientists who cited Western research were fired. Geneticists who believed in genes rather than Stalin's pet theories were arrested. Culture became a wasteland of patriotic slogans. The war heroes faced their own purge. Marshal Zhukov, savior of Moscow and conqueror of Berlin, was too popular. June 1946, Stalin struck. A formal order accused Zhukov of losing all modesty, claiming credit for operations that belonged to Stalin alone. The marshal was exiled to a minor district command. Other generals were arrested in the trophy case, accused of looting German art. Their real crime was being loved by their soldiers. Meanwhile, Stalin was building his empire in Eastern Europe. The Red Army had liberated these countries, and liberation meant permanent occupation. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, East Germany. Each got its own communist government, its own secret police trained by Soviet advisors, its own show trials. Local communists who'd fought the Nazis underground were replaced by Moscow-trained puppets. Only Tito refused to kneel. The Yugoslav partisan leader had liberated his own country, commanded his own army, and wouldn't take orders from Moscow. The split came in 1948. Stalin was stunned. "I will shake my little finger," he'd said, "and there will be no more Tito." But the finger shook, and Tito remained. The hunt for Titoists began immediately. Every Eastern European Communist Party was searched for secret sympathizers. Hungary's Laszlo Rajk, Bulgaria's Trecho Kostov, Czechoslovakia's Rudolf Slansky, all executed after show trials where they confessed to being Western spies, Titoists, Zionists, whatever Stalin needed them to be. The satellite states learned their lesson. Independence meant death. June 1948. Stalin blockaded Berlin, cutting off Western access to their sectors of the city. He wanted to starve them out, force them to abandon Berlin entirely. The Western Allies responded with the airlift, flying supplies day and night. The blockade failed, but the message was clear. Europe was now divided. Churchill would call it the Iron Curtain. While Stalin played imperial games, his own people starved again. The 1946 harvest failed, partly due to drought, mostly due to the collective farm system. 1.5 million died, while grain was exported to the new satellite states. The victory that was supposed to bring relief had brought only new forms of suffering. The Iron Curtain trapped those on both sides. Chapter 17. The Tyrant's Last Terror. Andrei Zhdanov died in August 1948, and the vultures began circling before his body was cold. His death upset the delicate balance in Stalin's court. Beria and Malenkov saw opportunity. They whispered to Stalin about a conspiracy in Leningrad, Zhdanov's old power base. Small things at first, an unauthorized trade fair, some irregular bookkeeping. But Stalin knew how to grow seeds into forests. The Leningrad affair began with administrative violations and ended with executions. By September 1950, the charges had mutated from protectionism to espionage. Nikolai Voznesensky, the brilliant economic planner, Alexei Kuznetsov, the young Central Committee secretary, both shot after secret trials. Hundreds of others connected to Leningrad were swept away. The post-war generation of leaders was being methodically destroyed. Stalin turned next on his oldest comrades. Molotov's Jewish wife, Polina Zemchuzhina, was accused of connections to anti-Soviet Jewish nationalists. Stalin forced Molotov to divorce her, then made the Politburo vote on her expulsion from the party. Molotov abstained. That single abstention was an act of defiance Stalin would never forgive. Molotov had to write a groveling apology, begging forgiveness for his weakness. March 1949. Both Molotov and Mikoyan were dismissed from their ministries. These men who'd been with Stalin since the Civil War were now learning what their loyalty was worth. The campaign against ruthless cosmopolitans intensified. Jewish writers, scientists, theater directors, all purged. Stalin told his inner circle that any Jewish nationalist was an agent of American intelligence. They feel obligation to the Americans, he explained, as if revealing a scientific law. The madness reached its peak with the Doctor's Plot in late 1952. Prominent Kremlin physicians, most of them Jewish, were arrested for allegedly plotting to murder Soviet leaders through medical malpractice. Stalin personally directed the investigation, ordering his security chief to use torture. Beat them until they confess, he said. Beat them like dogs. While orchestrating terror at home, Stalin was playing global chess. He'd given Kim Il-sung permission to invade South Korea in 1950, then pushed China to enter when the Americans intervened. The war bled America, while costing Stalin nothing. He advised the Chinese to drag it out. This war gives the Americans headaches, he told Zhou Enlai. Have patience. October 1952. The 19th Party Congress, the first in 13 years. Stalin expanded the Politburo massively, diluting the old guard's power. He publicly humiliated Molotov and Mikoyan, accusing them of cowardice and weakness. The stage was set for a new Great Terror. Lists were being drawn up. The cattle cars were ready. But the old man's body was failing. His memory slipped. He confused names, forgot faces. The strokes were coming more frequently. March 1st, 1953, the final one arrived. The tyrant who'd killed millions died gasping on his Dhaka floor while his terrified courtiers watched, too frightened to call for help until it was too late. Epilogue: The Ghost of Stalin. March 1st, 1953. Stalin had dinner with his inner circle, telling stories, forcing them to drink. They left at 4 in the morning. By noon the next day, his guards grew nervous. No movement from his rooms, but who dared enter uninvited? Finally, at 10 that night, they found him on the floor, soaked in his own urine, barely breathing. A cerebral hemorrhage had exploded in his brain. Beria, Malenkov, Khrushchev, and Bulganin arrived at the Dhaka. They stood around the dying tyrant, terrified he might recover and punish them for seeing him helpless. Hours passed before they called doctors. While Stalin lay unconscious, they were already dividing his empire. On March 5th, even as he still breathed, they abolished his newly created presidium and stripped him of his posts. 9:50 p.m. March 5th. Stalin's daughter Svetlana watched his final moment. He suddenly lifted his left hand, she wrote, as though pointing to something above and bringing down a curse on them all. Then nothing. The man who'd ruled through terror for 30 years was gone, leaving behind a nation that didn't know whether to weep or celebrate. Moscow erupted in genuine grief and secret relief. The crowds at his public viewing crushed each other in panic. 109 people died trying to see his corpse, the terror continuing even after his death. But the secret police also reported other reactions. A railroad worker was arrested for saying a dog had died, a dog's death. Good that he died, the man said. Maybe the collective farms would end and life would get easier. His heirs moved with stunning speed to dismantle the machinery of his final terror. Within a month, the doctor's plot was declared a fabrication. The accused physicians were released. The Gulag population was cut in half through mass amnesty. Torture was formally banned. The massive construction projects that had consumed the budget were halted. An armistice was sought in Korea. But Stalin's ghost wouldn't die so easily. His system had created millions who benefited from it. Party officials with their special stores, urban workers fed by grain stolen from peasants, veterans who credited him with victory over fascism. The terror was gone, but the structures remained. The collective farms, the one-party state, the empire in Eastern Europe. Decades later, in post-Soviet Russia, that ghost would rise again. Politicians would invoke his firm hand, his great empire, his victory over the Nazis. The millions dead would be forgotten or justified as necessary sacrifices. Polls would show young Russians admiring the strong leader who made their country feared. This is Stalin's most dangerous creation. Not the terror which died with him, but the myth which lives on. The image of the wise leader making hard choices for the nation's glory. It ignores the Ukrainian villages where everyone starved, the Polish officers shot at Katyn, the countless ordinary people who vanished into camps. This forgetting, this willful blindness, ensures that somewhere, sometime, another Stalin waits to be born.